Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the International Seminars Global Rivers in the Anthropocene. For me, it's a big pleasure to introduce Professors Dr. Sergei Chalov from Lomonosov Moscow State University. Professor Chalov received his master and PhD in fluvial processes and hydrology from the Faculty of Geography at Lomonosov. He's currently associate professor at the hydrology department of the Faculty of Geography, and also the head of the fluvial processes and erosion laboratory of Lomonosov Moscow State University. Additionally to that, Dr. Chalov is the head of the Pan-Eurasian Experiment Moscow office and the current president of the International Commission on Continental Erosion of the International Association of Hydrological Science. Professor Chalov is also a member of the editorial boards of several journals, such as Theoretical and Applied Climatology, Geography, Environment, Sustainability, and the vice editor-in-chief of the Russian Geographical Society Proceedings. The research interests of Professor Chalov focus on hydrology, fluvial processes, sediment transport, remote sensing applications for sediment transport, stream ecology, hydrobiodiversity, and fluvial hazards. He has been researching not only Russian rivers, but also rivers in Sweden and Mongolia. He's a pioneer to introduce a new area of sediment transport and sediment quality research in Russia, linking hydrodynamics and geochemistry, as well as he has been developing new tools to assess sediment transport monitoring using remote sensing techniques. In my particular opinion, because of course I love big rivers, is that a very important contribution by Professor Chalov is his research on large Arctic rivers. For over 15 years, Sergei has been working on field-based projects on sediment transport and geomorphology in rivers of the Arctic and Siberia, such as the Obi, the Yenisei, the Lena, Kolyma. Also have been working in the Kamchatka Peninsula, the Sakhalin Island, and the Kibini Mountains. Since 2011, he also coordinates a research program in the Baikal Lake with the support from the Russian Ministry of Education and Science, the United Nations Development Program, and the Russian Geographical Society. For me, what I said before, it's a big pleasure having him in our seminar series. Please welcome Sergei. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Edgardo, and good morning and good afternoon, depends on the time, for all the participants of this seminar. And of course, it's a big pleasure to make this trans-ocean talk, and it's nice to reach you in as far as I assume that the most of the participants of the seminar are from the Brazil, so it's nice to reach you through the ocean. And I would talk about the rivers which are far from you. I would talk about the rivers located in Russia, and the photo which is on the first screen is related to the Lena River. I would talk a lot about this river, just one of the case examples in my talk. And this is the river, not the first one in the scale of the large Russian rivers. but it's quite interesting in the regard of many processes. We are dealing with these periods now in the riverine processes. And actually, I would say for some few more words about myself, and about the institution I represent. So I'm from the Faculty of Geography of Lomonosov Moscow State University. And here we have two departments which deals with rivers. It's the hydrology department, which actually I'm working in, and also the Makeyev Laboratory of Soil Erosion and Fluvial Processes, the place which I'm currently staying in, and that's quite big group of scientists which are working with in this team here. Is the largest institution and largest research facility in Russia who work with the problems related to soil, partly with the soil erosion, which is I think we're very close to the riverine process, but mostly with the fluvial process. And here it's the history of almost 60 years of the very complicated and full-scale research on this stuff. This laboratory was founded in 1969 by Professor Nikolai Makeyev. So it's the photo of the Professor Makeyev, who is very famous Russian scientist and actually the founder of all this research direction. So I'm sitting under his portrait, and so I would be happy if someone would be interested in some links which I provided in these slides with the research and some other activities we're doing. And I would then go to some examples of what we are doing here in Russia. And of course, my talk would be more like a lecture, which represents some key facts about the rivers of Russia. And this is the first point of the presentation. And second, the third will be more related to some examples. As far as it's not possible to provide a full-scale overview of everything related to the rivers, so the presentation will be more focused on the case studies and the certain maybe examples of the processes which are crucial, urgent, interesting, and which we're making a research about. So the first part of the lecture is about rivers of Russia, like a very short overview. Here, my idea is to give you some understanding what we are talking about, the scales. So Russia is the first in terms of the territory country in the world, and it's located in almost, it takes, I guess, fifth or sixth part of the Eurasian continent. And this means that there is plenty of territory which can support big rivers to be initiate here and to flow through these territories. And if we look on the list of the largest rivers of the world, in terms of the length, it's the left column, and in terms of the right, in terms of the annual water discharge, it's the right column. We see that the list of 15, how many rivers were able to stay in this table. So this list contains 4 or 5 Russian rivers. So we are definitely not the largest, not comparable to Amazonka, for example, or some other mega rivers of the world, but are included into the top 10 of the largest rivers. And this is especially due to the huge Arctic watershed or Pan-Arctic watershed, which is the big territory, and main part of Russia is located in this Pan-Arctic watershed, with the formation of the 58% of the Arctic terrestrial water flux. I mean, formation from Russian territory to which the water coming to the Arctic Ocean. And this area is incredibly interesting in terms of the different climate zones which are covered by Russia. So the largest Russian mega rivers originate in the steppe zone. It's in very dry climate, and have its end into the tundra zone in the permafrost territory in the very 70s-degree north altitudes. So the differentiation is huge, and the rivers are very different in this regard. And also, again, back to the size. So this is the photo from the Ob River, which is one of these three largest Arctic rivers, so Ob, Yenisei, and Lena. We call it the Arctic pillars, and which like make a monument or make a big basement for the Arctic Ocean in terms of the water and in terms of how we see them on the map. And so this is the river, which I don't think is very exact thing, which I can make something incredible for the Brazilian scientists or Brazilian people, as far as you have this Amazonian plain, which is much bigger than the Russian one. But this Ob River is number 2 in terms of the highest floodplain in the world. And the channel on the screen with this huge railroad bridge is just the small part of this Ob River in the it's not even the main downstream of the river. It's more or less the midstream near the Lugansk city. It's this channel is called Luganska Ob. So the terms of the scale is very important in this regard, but it's also important to mention that the rivers are not only the mega rivers itself, the largest rivers. And if we look on the whole variety of the conditions which we have in Russia in terms of the rivers, we will see that anyway, it's like 95% of the rivers are small one, which are flowing into some exact small climatic conditions. And if we talk about the river type, then it's the main part of the Russian territory is the plains. And then the plain types of the rivers are also the dominance in the terms of the distribution, with very, in this diagram, you will see that's like a few mountain rivers, but anyway, due to huge territory, these few percent of the mountain rivers means that we have the thousands of rivers which are formed in the mountains. And of course, meandering channels are the dominant compared to the braided one or to the straight one, also because we have for preliminary the plain rivers as the main part of the free-forming conditions for rivers to form. And so I mentioned the second largest floodplain in the world, and another thing which is also the second one is the second largest world delta, which is the Delta Lena, which is the second after also Amazonka. And it's the biggest delta in the Arctic, which is another example of some conditions which will relate to the scales in Russia. So the territory of this one particular delta is much bigger than some countries, or comparable to some European countries. So the Russia, which is usually tend to be or supposed to be the European country, in terms of the scale, is something very specific one, and contain a huge variability of the river conditions. So, and all this I would try to then talk about the present examples, what we are facing in terms of the hydrology, hydrogeomorphology, hydrogeochemistry with these rivers. And I would try, firstly, before I would switch to these parts related to the more close topics with my lecture, I would try to say a few words about what is this Anthropocene means, and what is the Anthropocene in the river system. So where we are in this talk and in general. And for that, I use this picture from the tributaries of the Black Sea catchments, and this picture shows that we have the very long story of the alterations in the river system, and these alterations started in the almost more than 2,000 years ago, when the first active deforestation occurs. And since that, this is the sediment yield of these rivers, tributaries of the Black Sea. So it's like a case example of the territory. And since that, actually, we have the Anthropocene. The river were changing. The river were changing in terms of the flow, the sediment transport, in terms of the morphology. And until the very recent periods, or until now, the rivers which are dominant in the Eurasia are significantly changed compared to the present conditions. But in terms of the actually the sediment yields, the situation was very fastly changed during the last 50 days because of dam construction. And at least in terms of the sediments which are flowing into the ocean, into the sea, due to this very active dam construction, the rivers came to the pristine condition, more or less, in terms again of the flux which the river brings to the seas, to the oceans. And since the dams were covering the whole territory, the sediment yield was dropped significantly to the almost background values. And in this regard, this 50 or 100 years of the dam construction and very intense change in the techniques which people use to manage the rivers, actually this period is most interesting for us, for the scientists, and I would mostly focus on this in my talk later on. So I would talk mostly about the 21st century in the stories about the rivers, and I would mostly talk about also the issues not only related to the human impacts, but also related to the climate. And this is the thing which I would actually divide in my presentation. The first is the issues related to the natural processes and what is happening with the rivers in terms of the climate, hydrology, or some base level effects, and permafrost, which is very interesting example of the changes. So with all these 4 points, I would mostly relate to the first one, which are, so all these points are closely connected, and the climate changing climate is the dominant feature, also related to the Anthropocene, how we understand the Anthropocene in terms of the hydroclimatic system, or in terms of the more general view, not just the river processes, but the global processes. So the change of the climate is the issue which is the very important example of the human impacts on the world, on the Earth, not on the world, on the Earth. And this climate change affect the hydrology and many other processes. And in terms of how the river reacts, of course, the permafrost change in the Russian scale is very important. And in this second part of my presentation, I would mostly talk about some examples related to this hydroclimatic systems. So actually, this diagram shows the very complicated nature of the river change. River change in terms of the reaction to the different processes which are influence the river condition. So, and the dominant processes are the climate, which is most fastly changing thing in all these variety of the processes, and the human activities, which I leave at the moment outside of the scope of discussion. And the climates, both with the geology and human activities, influence variety of the secondary and the main drivers of the river changes, which are finally bring us to the most, let's say, evident picture of the rivers is the river channels, how they shaped, how the channel patterns are formed, and a combination of the water runoff, sediment load, human impacts, the base level condition, the geology, both with some more less important processes, phenomena happens in the rivers, they altogether interrelate, driven from the climate, or pushing from the human activities, and bring to the certain conditions of the channel changes. And this climate issue is the thing which is incredibly interesting in terms of what's going on in the scale of Russia now. And as far as the country is very, let's say, long in the locations from the north to the south, there are two very contradictory stories which we can take from the climate change. So the north of the Russia experiencing the very fast warming trends, which can be detected both in the scale of the huge territories which originates in the south of Russia, and this is the land catchment as an example. So on this map you can see the land catchment which started from almost the border of Russia and China, and here the average temperatures for the last, especially approximately 20 years, are significantly increased. But if we go directly to the, and this is the black line on this scale, and if we go to the Lena Delta, which is the smallest point on the scales of the catchment and located just near the Arctic Ocean, the rates of the increase are even more drastic. So the main story from that we have the pronouncing and much more significant rates of the climate change in the very north parts of the Russia. And here we can also see the different scenarios related to the temperatures in the on these points on the very north, and the local conditions are very fast varies around. And it's interesting that if we look then to the in these conditions of the generally warming climate, we look on the runoff of Russian rivers, we will see that in average the runoff is decreasing, and for the last almost 30 years the general trend for the runoff will be the decrease of the annual runoffs, which was reported recently from different overviews, these global like regional trends. And the main feature would be to say that's not that the annual runoff is declining. The main feature will be, or the main parameter of this change will be to say that we have the increase in the north of the runoff and decrease in the south. And here I would show the second example for the first example of the exactly the hydrological signals of the climate change. Actually, from the conditions of the south territories, there is the Volga catchment, and there is the another river Hoper from the Don, so that's correctly written. It's the tributary of Don River, and this river for the almost century time scale experienced the very fast drop in the water runoff. So that's much less water is entering the seas, much less water entering the reservoirs. And here in the south, that's the main hydrological related to the rivers problems for today is the big drop of the water runoff. And this is completely opposite to what we see in the north. And here in the north, for the most of the catchment and the rivers, following these trends and the increase of the air temperatures, we have also the increase of the water runoff. And in some certain areas, the increase is much more significant than it's also related to the rates of the climate warming rates. And for example, there is up to 20% increase of the annual runoff on some northern rivers. And here the main explanation for that is the permafrost. The permafrost thaw and the release of the water and also the huge amount of the sediments and organic material from the thawing permafrost is the issue of the northern rivers. And I would firstly jump maybe to a bit further on in my presentation to the permafrost distribution, why it's so important in the Russian scale. And here I will show this diagram firstly, which is demonstrate the distribution of the permafrost over the largest polar river catchment. And you see that there is few quite large rivers, for example, Kolyma, which is entirely located in the permafrost territory. And this is quite big river in terms of the water runoff, and the catchment it's almost in the top. And this is, of course, then the climate impacts on the permafrost became the very important signal to the riverine processes. And this is the main explanation which at the moment are used by scientists to talk about the increase of the water runoff in the north. And this situation is also supported by or followed by very interesting examples related to the both sediment transport and to the channel evolution itself. And this increase of the water runoff in the north is one of the things which significantly shifted the channel pattern regime for many rivers of Russia. And this picture demonstrates the example of the Severnaya Dvina River, Northern Dvina, we call it. It's also polar Arctic rivers flowing in the European part of Russia. And the increase of the water runoff for during the last last dozens of years, under the second half of the 20th century, was also related to the big changes in the channel pattern evolution, related to the increase of the bank erosion rates under the higher water discharges. And this particular example show the big and very fast change of the river pattern and some very long reach of the Severnaya Dvina River, due to the inputs of huge amounts of the bank erosion material into the river system. So this place called Tolokonne Mountain, it's one of the biggest old lacustrine deposits in this northern area. And because of the increased wash of this wall, which is like 50 meters height wall of the river, the big amount of that's located here on the map, big amount of the sediments which were start to enter sand, entering the river, bring river to the condition of the very unstable system. And then it came to the situation that the river started very fastly changed in terms of the big accumulation rates here, big deposition rates. And if like century ago, it was primary the river, which is was mostly meandering with very low rates of the just some small floodplain channels, side floodplain channels existed here. So during the last 50 years, it's changed to the very complicated in terms of the, for example, navigation, maintenance river system with the few parallel branches and very fast rates of the flow redistribution between the branches, because again the reason was this climatic signal from the on the bank erosion on the reach upstream from this particular bank. Then there is another picture which I would use for certainly describing how the consequences of climate change can alter today the riverine system. Is this very famous approach as a discharge slope diagrams. And here we have the very clear representation how the increase of their discharge can alter the channel patterns in terms of this discharge to slope ratio. So if we have the increase of the discharge, we have the increase of the riverine power, the flow power, and the flow power, the river became readjusted to the new conditions. And there are a few examples across on the regional scales when there is rather fast changes in the river pattern happens because of the changes in these river inflow conditions. And this bring as the again, so we talk about the climate change as the feature of the Anthropocene, then we talk about the impacts of the climate on the river dynamics, and then these changes in the river dynamics is usually a big pressure to the human activities on the river, either because we have to adapt the new navigational waterways routes, so we have to protect the settlements which are located in the river banks and so on. So this is the issue which is very important in terms of the challenges related to the climate condition. So another thing with the climate and with the changes which are related to the 20th century stories is the fluctuations in the water runoff. And this is example come from the river Terek, which originates in the Caucasus mountain and bring its water to the Caspian Sea. And here the story related to the water runoff was mostly connected with the changes in these sea level conditions. And what happens in these tributaries of this Caspian Sea because of the sea level change? So there was very fast increase during the 1780s period of the sea level. And because of that, and due to this base level effect or change of the base level, the river, which was currently very fastly increased, start to grade, and the rates of aggradation are like the meters during this 10 years period, and this brings to the huge flooding or around the system, around the territory. And at the moment, this is one of the most like difficult areas for. It's very important agricultural part of Russia, and the huge floodplains are huge plains, not the floodplains, just huge plains are close to this Terek River. And because of these high gradation rates related to the change of the base level conditions, and the base level conditions is because of the some mix between the climate and tectonics, and the problem of this channel evolution, which was switched compared to what we have in the past, is another example of the issues related to the Anthropocene environments. And then I would finish this part of the talk with the examples of the permafrost impacts on the river system. And there is the great stories which are coming now from the northern territories. And here we have these very interesting environments called Yedoma. It's the big walls of frozen ice-rich silt, which are located along the rivers. And because of the increase of the air temperatures here, these mostly stable territories, mostly stable in terms of the geomorphology, recently became very active. And this means that they are simply melting. And due to this melting, they bring a huge amount of the sediments into the river system. And you will see how this ridge, which is the right bank of the Kolomar River, support or supply a huge amount of sediments into the river system. And the proof that this is the climate signal in these processes is came from the analysis of the remote sensing images, which were done based on the estimates of the plumes, the sediments, the distance of the sediments which originate from the this sowing wall, and we compared the air temperatures during the summer season and during the days when the satellite image was taken with the length of the plume. How long from the wall of this Yedoma ice ridge formation the sediments from a exact increased concentration, turbidities. And we found that there is a correlation between the daily air temperatures and this distance of the plume. What does it mean? It means that actually the air temperatures influence the amount of the sediments which are entering the river system. And it means that we have the exact signal on the riverine transport from the climate. And this is relationships are very complicated. We can say that the temperature impacts on the melting condition are very broad, and they are both active in terms of the recent signal when we have just 5 days temperature prior to the image days, or there's a cumulative effect, and the such kind of permafrost areas are accumulates the heat and then melting, and we see the better relationship between the these plume lengths and the 20 days air temperature sum. And the last examples for this part of the lecture comes from the again delta of the Lena, and here we can see based on the distribution of the intensity of the channel change over the river system, we see how the highest rates of the channel intensity change. So I wouldn't go into detail how this map was obtained. So it's just the combination of different images, but we see that the darker places on this image, on this Lena Delta area, the darker places here are related to the high intensities of the bank erosion. And this area particularly coincide with the distribution of the again similar Yidoma ice ridge formations. And this means that the highest intensities of the riverine change are due to the fast degradation of such kind of the bank. And this is the first arrow show this link, and the second arrow show that due to this degradation we can fix the increase of the also sediment transport condition in this area. And this brings us to the conclusion that due to this climatic signal, at the present we have increase of the transport of the sediments and also the all deposited organic from this particular reaches of the river to the Arctic Ocean. And this became the very important biogeochemical process which is related to the rivers in the Arctic. And so I will jump to the last part of the talk and so this lecture, and come to the things which are more closely related to the meaning of Anthropocene. So the things which are climate warming is the Anthropocene in its, let's say, in its consequences. And here I would show some examples which are quite important in Russia in terms of the river change and human activities. And actually I would talk about three cases. It's the dams, it's the mining, and it's the river management, river regulation work. So, is it okay now, Edgar? You have?
Yeah, there was a technical problem, but please, you can keep going ahead. I think it was
okay, I will. So I would just again start. Yes. I'm coming back. Okay, good. So I'm back. Sorry, I don't know if this is my fault or something happening in the network. So, but it's good that actually I'm on the. Yeah, let me know if everything is okay. I guess yes. Okay. And this was a good break before the third part of the lecture. And I will talk about 3 more cases related to human activities. And I will start from the dams. Russia is very famous for these dam alterations of the river system. And there is the huge cascades on few large rivers of Russia, on the Volga, on the Yenisei, on the Angara. But if we look on the, if we compare our dams with the other countries like China, USA, India, Japan, and many others, we will see that Russia is not very intense or active in terms of the dams construction. We have only 62 large dams and about 107 reservoirs itself. And so this means that compared to the territory, the amount of the large dams per some kilometers of the area is really small. But anyway, there are quite big dam exist, and it's almost there is all the large river system have at least some of the large dams which are distributed of the country. And then the issue of the dams, of course, is important to mention in this scale. And the main thing which we think when talk about the dam's impact on the rivers itself is the trapping of the sediments. And there is the average trapping efficiency of the Russian reservoirs, something about 90%. So 90% of the sediments which are delivered to the reservoirs are trapped there. So according to the Brun formula, Brun model, which is quite well fits the scale, the conditions of Russia. And there is some numbers of the total sediment stored in the reservoirs in Russia, which is quite small compared to the global river influx, but nevertheless, it significantly alters the sediment budgets into the Russian scale. And if we proceed with that, we can see very few examples of the significant changes of the river sediment transport, which happens due to the constructions of the dams. And there is in the northern rivers, there are 2 major examples. This the Yenisei River, which faced almost 50% decrease of the sediment transport, and the Kolyma River, which also faced like even up to 70% sediment yield decline due to the construction of the dams. Actually, these 2 are quite the main one in terms of the how many dams are located here. And if we proceed to also other examples, we can say that there is the most famous example of the dam construction is the Volga River, which is there. This is the Volga tributary of Caspian Sea. And here we have the big cascade of the dams. And in this cascade, also the average trapping of the sediments is up to 90%. But these traps have a very important environmental influence on the river, as far as the mostly heavily populated area with the Moscow city and almost 20-30% of Russian population live in these catchments. And because of that, all the variety of pollutants, including the very newly formed particles, are trapped in these reservoirs and not delivered to the downstream areas into the Caspian Sea. So the dams became very important, fundamental thing in terms of how they influence their river system and environment itself. But of course, there is also a few more interesting examples of the consequences of the dam construction, and one of them is the influence on also the channel processes. And the most nice story we can take from the sandy plain rivers from the downstream parts below the dams, where due to the incision on the Ob and Volga River, there was significant changes of the channel patterns, which shifted from the braided to the mostly meandering one, or at least the non-braided patterns, because of the incision of the water and the redistribution of the flow into the dominant channel. So you can see that the green is the pre-dam shape of the river, of the river channel, and the red is the let's say post-dam shape. So the channel pattern changed because of this influence of the dam, because of this incision. And incision can let in these plain rivers like up to 2 meters of the decrease. So it became also the big issue for the navigation purposes. But in general, that's degradation of the river channels below the dam is a thing which faced a lot of concerns both for the river management and for the environment itself. Then there is a old story about the open cast forestry gold mining, which have developed in Russia a lot, especially during the era of the middle of the century, with the big social let's say situation in the country, with the big facilities which were built on these territories to start the open cast mining, gold mining. And at the moment there is the very huge territories, especially in the Far East and the East Siberia, which are disturbed by the open cast mining. And if we look on the heat map, we can see that there is almost 1% of the total river length is disturbed. And so one can say that 1% is not a lot, but in terms of the riverine system, when we have the 1% of the river length, which is totally new in terms of the both flow formation, sediment generation, and the channel patterns and everything, so that the new rivers exist on these reaches. And in some particular cases, there is even more than 1% from the river network total length of the disturbed channels are. And so that's how it's looked like. It's very complicated territories, like on the moon in some way, as far as this landscape are completely with the removed vegetation. And of course, it's the areas of the intensified erosion. And for that reason, is these mine-affected river valleys are of big concern, both environmentally and also in terms of the post-mine effects on the conditions to manage this river around. And actually, of course, the main issues with the mining is the sediment yields. And there is the few examples how the mining affected the river sediment yields because of the intensified erosion. And the Coloma is one of this example, but it's not the lower Coloma, it's the particular reaches related to the mining industry. As far as I mentioned before, the Coloma is famous for its reservoir impact on the river sediment yields, and this is always these antagonistic or contradictive effects in the formation of the sediments are always there. So some processes influence the generation of the sediments, and some processes or some human alteration effect like a traps, or sometimes we have quite a balance between the processes which increase the sediment delivery to the rivers and those which decrease the sediment delivery. But also quite interesting to look into these areas in terms of how exactly the sediments are formed here. And there is a few stories which were quite very detailedly studied in Russia. And the main thing which came from these stories is that due to very intensive changes in the river channels itself, the main thing which affects the sediment yields and the pollution of the rivers from the mining territories is the channel erosion. And this is mostly due to the straightening of the river channels, which happens in these areas. And the straightening leads to the increase of the stream power, and then there is increase of bank erosion and also bed erosion. And this leads to the involvement of the huge amount of the material. And then channel erosion became more important than the effluents from some settling ponds, than the mine wastewater overflow, and even then the soil erosion, which is sometimes even not so important compared to these other processes. And this is how this evolution of the channel erosion as a primary impact of mining disturbances looks like. When we can, in some particular reaches, face the just very fast 2-3-fold increase of the sediment concentration along just the particular reaches because of this natural tendency of the river to form a meandering shape. And then when the men alter the river channels, make it straight, then the river wants to be again the meandering, and the bank erosion where it can be eroded, it's become eroded. Yes, and but again, as I said, the territory is very huge, and we still have almost elsewhere, and especially in the scales of the large rivers, almost natural shapes of the rivers. And this is much compared to the condition in the Latin America, of course, and this is very opposite to what we have in the Europe. So almost nowhere in the European countries we can find such examples of the natural rivers. And for example, the largest European river, Danube, is fully with one small particular 30 kilometers reach is not having the natural floodplains, whereas here we have elsewhere the natural river regime. And actually I lost here the picture of how the regulated channel patterns looks like, and it's usually completely different from what we have here in the scales of Russia. But anyway, this natural regime means that there is a lot of issues for the different navigation. And there we came to the last point, which I was planning to talk about, is the channel management and river dredging, which happens elsewhere in the Russian scale due to two things: is the material, which is the sand and gravel, which is important for the construction works. And the second thing is the navigation, and the dredging for the navigation is the second thing which usually occur on the most of the large rivers across the Russia. And this leads at the places where we have the abundant distribution of the channel quarries to very high rates of the beds level, and then the water level decrease. For example, the Oka River is very famous on that in this regard. This is one of the largest tributaries of the Volga again in European part of Russia. And this river is famous for the situation that its sand was the basement for the construction of the Moscow city. So there was a huge amount of the sand which was taken here and brought to the particular construction works in the city. And due to that, we faced during the second half of the 20th century the drop of the depths and drop of the water levels across the river channel up to a few meters. And you can see this in this screen, how the how the depths were, the water levels were dropped in the particular reaches. And of course, this was a fundamental impact also, again, environmental concern, because of the significant drop also of the inundation of floodplains, and then it has a big issue for agriculture. And this also led to problems with the navigation. So, and it's again like a loop of different concerns which we face in the period of the Anthropocene, making some benefit from the rivers and then having some trouble with the river system. And so with the last example of all these changes, I will show quite particular case related to the Russia. And as far as the territory is huge, and there is a very long border with the adjacent countries, and we share the border with the China, and this is almost 70% of this border is the Amur River, which is, we call it the border river, and the state border between Russia and China is coming across this border river. And this is particular feature of the Russia. That's so the left bank is the Russia, and there is only few large settlements and almost no significant, very low density of population. Only some single, as I said, settlements, some cities, Khabarovsk, Komsomolsk-na-Amur, and some local places. Whereas in the China, there is the whole right bank of the territory is concentrate a large amount of the cities, of the settlements, roads, and so on. And for the last 50 years, this was a very interesting natural experiment, how the river adapts to the in such condition of the bordering between two countries, one which have the low density population, the second have a high density population. That's all the right bank was constantly managed by the Chinese government to prevent the floods, to prevent the channel erosion, and this leads to the very fast shift of the river water levels. So actually the whole right bank, the Chinese bank of the river channel, was not available for the high water to pass, and then the water levels were redirected to the left part of the channel valley, or generally the available territory for flooding was much shortened. And when we faced the large flood, which happened in 2013, the water level compared to the condition which we can expect for the previous situation in the river valley morphology, the water level was increased almost for a few meters. And this led to the huge inundation just related to this problem of the specific way of the channel management. And another story with this is that due to the channel management, their main channel sometimes is changing, and there is always tricky things with the border, which sometimes led to some even conflicts between the as happens hopefully once and it would never happen again. But anyway, there is a big issue which is strictly related to the riverine issues in the Anthropocene, how the river management can influence the location of the state borders. And now there are a few very problematic spots on the Amur River, which were also discussed between the governments, how to manage the new conditions of the riverine flow. So with this, I would finish my talk, and as the small, let's say, information, and thank you for thanks for attending this lecture. I would inform you about the activities which I'm which I am at the moment involved. This is the International Commission of Continental Erosion. All the people who are interested in these erosion activities are very invited to join this community of scientists, which we have the regular conferences. And the near one conference will be next year in Germany in the July 2024. And there is already the website which is related to this conference, and the title of the conference is Sensitivity of Erosion in Sediment Transport to Recent Climate Changes. So it's like a small announce for those who can be interested in this issue and would be interested in joining these activities. So, and with this slide I will finish. And thanks all for the organizers for giving me a floor, and for those who were interested in this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sergey, for this fascinating and very didactic talk. Really, we enjoyed it a lot. It will be very useful also for our community. I would like to ask the public for questions. Remember that you can post your questions in the chat, so please submit your question as soon as possible. In my case, I think I can open some kind of question. It's a lot to discuss, but there is a question here by Jorge Abad that say, in the reach of the Severnaya, the BIMA that you show, there are main and secondary channels, right? So he asked which ones migrate faster along the floodplain. So when you compare the main channel or the secondary channel, when we concentrate the measure mobility?
I would say that's the fastest changes in this kind of the rivers, this unbranching rivers, is the evulsions itself. And when we have sort of the formation of the new channels through the floodplain, so the rates of the migration are the highest. But of course, the larger the channel, the higher the stream power is, the higher the energy is, and the higher the migration also happens. So that, of course, I would say that's in this regard, when we have the secondary and the main channels will take a lead in these migration rates due to the very simple physics. So if we have the similar other condition, the slopes, the curvature, and everything the same, then the migration rates on the main channel will be faster.
Okay, so this is also kind of observation in some of the figures you shown the parameters. For example, in the Volga, you mentioned braided. I mean, this is sometimes of a little confusion for the international community when we talk about it. Now you mentioned the unbranching. I think in many cases we are talking in reality when people refer to braided also to real unbranching, because there are islands, right? Not particularly only sandy bars or gravel bars that are characteristic of braided, but islands that make unbranching system, right? Mainly.
Yes, there's an interesting issue with this classification in the titles, and I always have to adapt the names, how we call it in a classification, how we use it in Russian language, to the international definitions. Then there are a lot of contradictions of what is, for example, an unbranching river, if we can call this sort of the floodplain separated by the islands, if we can call them unbranching. Yes, I agree that it's a big issue. That's usually the proper to say the braided is like bars, but of course in more general view, I think it's more or less in the literature it's agreed that we can call the braided just like a form where the river split it on different directions. And then here in the braided meaning, we can say that there is a bar braided, island braided, unbranching, and then something else like anastomosing, I don't know, a lot. Distributory. Yeah.
Please, more questions from the participants. We are looking to that. In between, I will continue with some points. I think for the student and for the public in general, you mentioned a very, very special case that was the Terek River, with the sea level change of 1.14 meter from 1978 to 1987. I think this is very relevant, very important to show to the people how much careful we have to be when assessing sea level changes. And we have all this discussion, the sea level changes, this global crisis, we have all these problems, right? Because if we consider that the global average sea level have been 21 to 24 centimeters, globally speaking, since 1880, point like the one that you shown here, this is extreme because of local condition. It's not related to basically mainly global. You have tectonic and other factors playing this extreme sea level change. This can modify every average that we can calculate globally. And I have been working with people doing this for a long time in different universities. And I disagree in some point because they are using a core or whatever. It's a very brief analysis of the coastal condition to plot some kind of curve, right, of sea level change without really assessing in deeper what the local conditions are. You see, we are going, for example, to use like example what you say, it should be catastrophic globally, right? But it's not. It's a local area, right? So this means that how much carefully we have to be with all these catastrophic scenarios, particularly when we consider that in the Middle Holocene, in some part of the world, we have very, very big ingression, bigger than any kind of predicted cure we have today for global change. For example, in the Middle Holocene, in many of the big rivers we have been working, right? So probably this deserves an additional comment from you about this problem.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I can add a little bit on this topic. That's there was an interesting story with this Cherokee base level effect. So the Caspian Sea was losing its level, and this was happening in the 70s, starting from the 50s. And there was the period when the Volga River, the main tributary of the Cherokee, of the Caspian Sea, was heavily. Actually, all the dams were constructed during this period, and the society was talking a lot against the hydrologists, saying like, "Look, you build the dams, and the Caspian Sea level is changing. This is because of your dams." And there was very, very big discussion in the society, and that's I would say that the green movement in the Soviet Union appeared during this period, and there was a lot of people who talked against these dams in general, and many dam projects were stopped at this moment because of this discussion. But then suddenly the sea decided climate decided in another way, tectonics decided in another way, and the sea level started to rise. And this was the thing which nobody expected, and a lot of, for example, settlements were already expanded and take the territory which was before the sea, and then suddenly the sea came back, and the concern was the huge. So it was all this the examples how then it's affect the river channel, just one of the very broad also social story in Russia. And so the one of the thing which was supposed to be the hugest environmental disaster suddenly appeared to be not related to any kind of the human impacts. I mean, the sea level changes. And so that actually hydrologist scientists talked about it. It was before I was born, but I know this story a lot. And the hydrologists started to talk about that it's not because of the dams. Look on the water balance, but you know how it works. That's the opinion was very against the dams, and then there was this story.
Thank you. We have another question by Ellen Lima de Andrade and say if you can comment a little more about the Russian policy for the water protection and water management. We have a pretty good law here in Brazil. The problem is probably enforcement of the law, but the law is good to protect our water resources in general. How is the situation? How this work in Russia about the legislation and so on?
So it's like a separate lecture to talk about the legislation. Very simple, very briefly, I would just comment that there is, it's difficult, I would say like that. It's a lot of contradictions. For example, we have a water code, so-called. It's like a constitution for the waters, for hydrologists. And this is the main document which is to protect the river system, but at the end, and to protect the waters. And for example, we have here, like an example of the contradiction, there is the, again, according to the law, there is, according to the legislation, to the law, we are not, there is all the human activities are not allowed in Russia in the corridor 250 meters from the river. And this is like a law. Nobody can build something or just nothing. But if you want to build something, you should build an embankment. And then, of course, there is like a way around. So you can go around the law, build an embankment and build a house and everything like that. So all this water protection system is very difficult. I guess it's like everywhere, but here it is like that. And yeah, permissible concentration is one of the dominant things which are used to protect the waters, and it's comparable to international standards. And also have many issues if it's for the huge territory of Russia, if we can use one value of some, I don't know, sediment concentration, for example, like a background condition, so it's not working. Yeah, but thank you for the question. It's an interesting topic.
We have another one, is a more specific question on morphology by Dr. Jorge Abad, and say, for the rivers that were stagnant, here it is, and produce erosive processes, are the efforts to restore them to natural conditions, or sea development does not allow to recover natural condition? I mean, but there are policies of river restoration for that. It's just, okay, let's keep the rivers doing the work and they recover by themselves. How was?
So this the issue which I mentioned about the straightening is mostly related to the mining areas, and here the issue of restoration, unfortunately, exactly in terms of those legislation, is very poorly developed in Russia. So the mostly that works like that the miners, they take the gold, like in few words, take a gold and leave, and there is almost no restoration both in the river, on the landscape. And very typical that there is this landscape, which is just the natural rare covering of the some plants happening with the time, but actually the river valleys looks like this full of some heaps, tailings, and so on. And the same with the rivers, or with time, just the river adapts to new conditions. And as far as, again, the mining territory is usually something very remote, the rivers themselves, due to their channel evolution in these conditions, come to more or less natural shape. This is one thing which is related to what I mentioned in the talk. And if to talk about generally the restoration, it's not an issue at all in Russia. So we do not actually have this discussion even in the cities, for many reasons. Maybe because it's too much rivers around and too much water. I don't know. That's something which not came to even to the, for example, Moscow megacity. So in Moscow megacity, there's a lot of green parks. So rivers which are not nice in terms of the water quality, in terms of the river channel itself, but almost nobody cared. A lot of measures to build green zones and green parks and very nice routes for to walk and something like that, but nobody cared about the rivers. So this is, I think it's so, especially compared to what we see in the US with all these dam removal dam projects in Europe, in US, it's a big difference, and this is due to the mentality, to the just economy, traditions. So the restoration is not there at all.
We have two questions combined here by Dr. Landerley Santos, and it's related to the permafrost. So how you assess the difference in the permafrost to this variable that you estimated about the presence of permafrost in mountain areas or lowland areas, right? So how they behave differently to these variables. So you can explain a little more as the second part of the question about the challenges in investigating permafrost. As it, people is curious here to know more about that topic that is not common here.
So I will try to combine them in one answer. So the challenge is because it's the climate's effects on the environment. And so the consequences of climate change are always important elsewhere. And then it has a lot of environmental itself, the permafrost soil, and the impacts of the rivers on the permafrost stock have a lot of very important consequences for the hydrogeochemistry, for biogeochemistry, as far as the permafrost contains a lot of, it's like an archive of the old organic matter. And when the permafrost thaw and this organic matter go to the river, we completely changed the carbon budget, we changed the sediment budget because of this new source of the sediment formation. And especially in the area when we have all these issues with the carbon emission, that's now, maybe I would say that it's number one why we are looking into the permafrost, because of this because of this permafrost degradation and degradation of the areas related to the rivers is involved into the global carbon change. And this is what's going on in general, but of course there is a lot of differences what's changed in the mountains and the rivers. I would say just in general that the permafrost soil problem is more related to the lowlands, of course. As far as the mountain conditions, there is another story with the glaciers, and this is the issue for the mountain conditions. But the permafrost and the glacier degradation as well, and that's I would expect that if we talk about glaciology or cryolithology, then there is the glaciers in the mountains, the permafrost in the lowlands. That's the process which is a bit similar as far as the thawing and climate change influence this, but more or less it's distributed in this way. And also, of course, the intensity of the change and then the sensitivity to the climatic changes is more, in terms of the permafrost, is more evident in the lowlands. But again, I would talk only about the rivers. If we talk with the permafrost people, scientists, they can tell some other stories. But in terms of how the rivers react, connect, communicate with the permafrost, of course, it's the story about the lowlands.
Okay, thank you. Well, so we're going to, we can keep here talking for hours, enjoying your talk, but we have this limitation of time, of course, with the UFC channel. My last question is by myself. You mentioned that we have only 62 very large dams, right? Is what I understood in Russia. When we compare what you mentioned, it is in the table, the difference with other countries is huge. Particularly, we have been talking about BRICS countries with you in private, And in the BRICS, we have a big explosion of construction of dams. Particularly, you show India, you show China. We have a big amount of dams in Brazil. So seeing that Russia, with all this amount of incredible amount of rivers, is not pushing the systems, the fluvial system, like we are doing in other BRIC countries. Dams have been increasing also in Africa. What is the perspective? And in addition to that, what about middle and small dams? For example, in our country, we have a huge proliferation of small projects, right? Not only big ones, but a lot of small dams that have been built or are planned to be built in the country. How is the situation in Russia? And why is not happening probably that?
So that's of course just was the mostly focus of my talk was to the large rivers. So I mentioned the large dams. So large dams, they're higher than 15 meters. I don't know the statistics about the small dams. Of course, it's also, I think, they're comparable to your conditions in terms of how they are important into the level. Just the specific issue, and of course, the small dams and the small ponds, the small reservoirs are crucial for economy. For example, in the steppe zone, which they completely changed all the hydrological network, as far as that each small river have some small ponds which used as the water supply, which is used for also to prevent sometimes the erosion impacts onto the river system. And so this is happens. I just didn't put it into my talk, I would say, like that, the issue with the small dams. And maybe also, of course, because it's the scale of the impacts is more from this. Once large single dam can be seen in the scales of the huge river catchments. One small dam is the local impact, which is have cumulative effect. We have many small dams in the river system, but in one particular case, it's not so important. And also, what I can add to that there is almost nothing in the country level regarding the removal of these small dams. Not for the large dam, it's not exactly on there is no discussion at all. The small dams, which sometimes were built centuries ago, it's sometimes argued to restore them or to remove, and there is no certain policy on that, and this became also the tricky thing, how to for the future, also scientists, how to adapt the new conditions of all these dams to the situation.
Okay, Sergey, thank you very much. Our time is expiring. I would like to thank you again for participating in this series of seminars. Thank you very much. I would like to remember the audience as well that we expect to have additional talks on Indian rivers by Professor Rashid Singh and others at different parts of the world. So with this, we are going to close the seminars today. Thank you very much to everybody. Thank you, Sergey, once again for your participation.
Thank you.